Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about Common Core's English Language Arts standards, which are known in this state as North Dakota's English Language Arts.
For the record, can you your name and who you represent?
Sandra Stotsky. I don't represent anyone except myself.
Okay, thank you.
So I am going, you will all have my testimony, I believe, 5 pages in front of you, plus other writings that are available and what has been made available to you. And I just want to make the main point that my concern, based upon my background, knowledge, and experience, being on Common Core's Validation Committee, and having been a senior associate commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from '99 to 2003, is to make the point that what North Dakota needs, as do most of the states in this country, they need first-class academic standards in both English and in mathematics and in science, if they have chosen to also adopt next generation science standards, which are not Common Core, but aligned with Common Core. So you have the 3 critical areas of the curriculum to be concerned about for North Dakota students if you want them to be able to take advantage of 21st century jobs, given the development of the Bakken field and other opportunities that will arise in the future that will require a much higher level of mathematical and scientific as well as language skills than will be possible under Common Core. And I say this because I was in charge of all of the K-12 standards in the state of Massachusetts that put Massachusetts students at the very top of every state and national and international test that we participated in. There were other things I was responsible for, but having first-class standards was the beginning of making sure that academic achievement would develop and increase in all groups of students, because that was the philosophy I brought to them, an increase in academic achievement for all demographic groups, not just for some, and the importance of having content knowledge in all of the important areas of the K-12 curriculum. Now, I'm going to make the case that what you have in North Dakota, called your academic English Language Arts content standards, are Common Core's because the paper that your teacher group had to sign back several years ago was to adopt Common Core verbatim. So once you adopt something verbatim, they are the same, and they cannot be changed. That is the other thing you have to also be aware of. In reference to an earlier question about where do parents bring complaints, they can bring them, as they have been, to the Department of Public Instruction, but there's nothing that agency can do because the Common Core standards, which you use under a different name, have been copyrighted by 2 private organizations in Washington, D.C., and they have made it clear that there will be no changes until they decide, or perhaps the U.S. government decides, to revise and review them. We don't know when there will be changes. That is partly what is stimulating a lot of the grassroots rebellion by teachers and parents across this country, because they don't see any hope of changing copyrighted standards that their own departments of education, however they're called, adopted. And just to also answer another question that came up, I was on the State Board of Education in Massachusetts at the time of the adoption of Common Core standards. Why did we adopt them and dump what everyone knew were much better standards? Because we were offered $250 million in common race to the top money, and we did get it. Our governor was a friend of President Obama, and we were offered $250 million, which was hard for a Department of Education to turn down, And so we agreed to abandon our much better standards for $250 million. Let me go into a few of the highlights from my testimony. I want to be sure that I don't exceed the time before I make some of the major points I would like to set forth here. First of all, you need to know that I was a member of the validation committee for Common Core, along with Professor Milgram, whom you will hear from soon, and we could not sign off on Common Core's standards at any time, including the final version, which came out just after we had been asked to meet a deadline for signing on. We could not sign off because they were not internationally comparable or benchmarked to the best out there. They're not research-based, and I know the academic research very well because that is my background, and they're not rigorous. Despite the fact that you might hear that word used over and over again, parrot-like, Common Core's standards in math and in English will retard your students for the best 21st century jobs. It is true that local communities can add to these standards if they wish, but they will not be tested on any Common Core-based test because Common Core-based tests, such as Smarter Balance, will only assess what is in the standards, not on anything else that might have been adopted by local communities or even by the state. So I go on to point out in the section called Development of Common Core Standards, the point is that they were developed by private organizations in Washington, D.C., not by the U.S. government or by the states. I was on a state board. I knew what we were doing and not doing. They were developed by 3 private organizations, all funded by the Gates Foundation, and there are no records available. I've tried to get them, but there are no records available because they can't be FOIA'd. The standards writers, which is where the immediate problem with the standards begins, were not qualified for the work that they were asked to do. I will focus simply on the English language arts standards writers, one of whom is now president of the College Board and has aligned the SATs down to the level of Common Core. That was one of his charges. He is also revising all of the AP tests and syllabi so that they will no longer be as advanced placement work as they may have been many years ago when they were first developed. But the people who wrote the English language arts standards for Common Core had never taught at any level, had no background in English literature that would enable them to develop sound standards. They'd never published anything in the area, and they were unknown to the field at the time the standards were developed. So you have to understand that we do not even know why they were chosen, because no records are available. That is part of the background to these standards. That's important. What I do on the next couple of pages, where I talk about the flaws in North Dakota's current standards, I am referring to the flaws in Common Core because you adopted them verbatim. Yes, the teachers that were on your task force developed a few footnotes, a few more examples, a few other little curlicues, if you pardon the expression, to these standards, but the word verbatim is used several times in the memo from your own people at the DPI, and that is indeed what you have. Cut and paste. They are Common Core standards with North Dakota label on them. And what I would like to point out, and this goes to the final page, page 4 of my testimony, I give you a short summary about the issues that you have to consider, no matter what you are told. They are not rigorous. I know what rigorous standards look like because I helped to develop them in Massachusetts. They aren't. They're not internationally benchmarked. In 5 years, we've been asking for the names of the countries to which we were supposedly benchmarked because the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, ExxonMobil, and a number of other people who should know better, or organizations, keep saying that they are internationally benchmarked. Well, they are not. They can't name the countries, and there's no crosswalk showing how they compare to any of the much better standards that are in high-achieving areas like Singapore, South Korea, Japan. There is no research to support your current stress on more writing instead of reading. That's my own background, reading research. There is no research to support a stress on informational reading instead of literary study in the English class. I know that because I know the field, I know the research, and I've spoken to the people in the field who are well known as reading researchers. You will find over and over again a stress on something called informational texts in your high schools. There is no research that supports the stress on that in the English class in place of complex literary texts. And in fact, the research that is available suggests the opposite of what is being suggested by Common Core's writers and in the document. So the first thing I am suggesting through adoption of this bill is that North Dakota's legislators set up this interim committee, that's part of the bill, to develop rigorous, internationally benchmarked standards. If you want North Dakota students to be able to take advantage of the technological developments and economic boom taking place in this state, you need standards that will support high school math and science and English so they can go on to colleges, some form of post-secondary ed, where they can go into STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, math, which they cannot do today based on Common Core's or North Dakota's standards. There are others available to consider, and this is why you see other names being offered, of states that were known to have had better standards than Common Core's. And one of the questions that's regularly asked is, why didn't Common Core simply start with one of them and continue with one of them if it wanted to improve one of them? It didn't. It started from scratch with other goals in mind. Number two is perhaps the most important recommendation I can make to you. You need to ask your own experts in this state, in engineering, science, mathematics, and in the humanities, to develop entrance exams or matriculation tests, as they're often called, for your own institutions of higher education. I don't understand why North Dakota would want bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. deciding admission standards for your institutions, which is what happens with the use of a Common Core-based test and Common Core-based standards. The link that is made between standards called college ready is that students who are deemed on a grade 11 test to pass a Common Core-based test will be able to take 4-credit courses, FOR, 4-credit courses at the freshman level in college. That was the ultimate prize in this whole set of standards called college ready. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been called college ready. They make false claim that they will make students college ready by lowering the standard of what college ready is. And then students who go on must receive credit in their freshman year for the courses they take. Whereas you should have your own faculty, particularly in engineering, which is going to be increasingly important in this state and in other states that are developing oil and gas industries. You need your own experts, and you have them, to develop what they think are appropriate admission standards for North Dakota kids. There is no reason why decisions need to be made in Washington, D.C. about what the level of college readiness is for North Dakota. You can decide that yourself. I also suggest 2 different types of high school diplomas based on a very commonsensical observation that not all students want to go to college or can do the work that's required. And so that's just something to consider. New York State, as you may or may not know, for many, many years had different kinds of high school diplomas. It worked fine in New York State if you ask people about the difference between the general and the regent's diploma. You also want to be sure that you can, and this is number 4, revise whatever standards you have. That's the whole point of parent complaints. and local school board involvement, that whatever complaints you have can be translated at some point to people who are going to be able to say, let's set up a revision committee and let's get some experts from higher ed working with high school teachers as well as others to see how we can change the standards we're using. Can't take place with Common Core standards or your current North Dakota standards. And then finally, I'm going to end with this, because this turns out probably to be the most important issue today, and that is you need to look into the training of your teachers. They are the most important ingredient in every classroom, everywhere. And I have been involved in teacher education for 50 years. That is where you need to focus on what you can do to make sure that you have the kind of teachers who can teach to first-rate math and science and English standards. Because if you don't, it won't make any difference what kind of standards you have. They can't be taught in the classroom unless you have teachers capable of teaching to those standards, which was what I tried to make sure of in Massachusetts. And that was, to me, the secret of the success we had in the Bay State. I will finish now. I believe my time is up, and Professor Milgram will spend more time on the mathematics part of it, as I have focused on the ELA.
Thank you. Thank you for coming this morning. We'll take questions. Any questions for the previous three speakers? I believe Representative Couch had a question first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been talked about Nebraska has opted to never get in Common Core, and I was just wondering, they're a state something like us. I was just wondering what their standards are like compared to Common Core or some of the other states that aren't in Common Core. Can anybody answer that? Do they have good standards?
Question is, how does Nebraska's standards look since they're not in Common Core?
I am frankly not aware, because I have not looked at what Nebraska's current standards are. For a long time, they didn't have any standards, state standards at all, because they were holding out, even under No Child Left Behind. But I haven't looked at what they have adopted. I believe for testing purposes, they are using a testing development company, possibly located in Kansas, but this is not clear information on my part, that is developing Common Core-based like tests. So I suspect whatever standards that were adopted are like Common Core, but I have no evidence from having looked to make sure.
Let me continue.
You may.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because this past summer I was at a Midwestern Council of State Governments meeting down there, and their former Commissioner of Agriculture, whatever they're called, Secretary of Agriculture, when asked why they did not join the Common Core Consortium, said because we had just developed standards on our own. And he said they look very much like Common Core.
There's your answer.
Ms. Stotsky, while you're there, I'll ask you a couple quick questions. So how many, you said yourself and Professor Milgram were the only two that didn't sign off on the standards?
There were 5 members
five.
of this less than 30-member committee.
Okay. And, okay, I just looking at your back. So you're a professor at Arkansas?
I retired.
Have you ever taught in K-12?
Yes.
You did, okay, all right.
Dr. Stotsky, we've heard reports by other people that I think one person had said that it would cost $100 million to create an assessment in our state. And so the question is, how much would it cost North Dakota to implement its own educational standards and or create its own test in your experience?
The question can't be given an answer of one figure. It would all depend on which standards might be developed ultimately by North Dakota over, say, a 2-year period. It could take one of the existing sets of highly rated standards, such as the names that were mentioned, California, Indiana 2006, Massachusetts 2000, or the Minnesota current standards, because their mathematicians would not go along with Common Core to begin with, so that's why I like to point them out in particular. But that would be virtually free to adopt existing highly rated standards already there that have proven themselves in some way. And there is certainly evidence in California and in Massachusetts, probably in Minnesota to this day, because they haven't changed, as far as I know, their mathematics standards, but I think Professor Milgram would know more about that than I would. The cost of assessing them would again depend on what you end with. Massachusetts has free test items available, 10 years worth, on its website, because our statute under which I operated back when we were creating these standards and the tests that were going on at that time, the statute that came out in 1993, the Massachusetts Education Reform Act, required annual release of all tested items. It's actually a very good point to keep in mind. You will not get from Smarter Balance or Park a release, full release of the items that were used to judge your students. No one will ever see them. They haven't been vetted by your own teachers, by your higher ed experts. It's simply not there. But under Massachusetts statute in '93, we had to release them annually. So they are available on the department's website, and they are used to this day as models of good test items because we did make sure we had input from higher ed.
Dr. Stotsky, when it comes to the question of money, then you said it depends on what we adopt, but this bill talks about developing, building our own. What do you
Right.
think? What do you think something like that would cost?
It could be well within the 750,000 figure that has been set forth for the executive director of what is an interim project. Remember, this is an ad hoc committee, it's an ad hoc project.
So we can develop our standards for 750,000?
Under 750. If you are going to start with a blueprint or a foundational document from one of the best rated sets, which are well known in the country from before Common Core, that would not take much time. In mathematics, good mathematics is good mathematics, so there's no reason why that would cost a fortune. Californians were known as the gold standard for the country at the time they developed the mathematics
How much did
standards.
theirs cost?
Well,
We didn't have any.
maybe I should answer.
You should answer that. The question of cost, you would know of what he wrote. In Massachusetts, we had no specific cost per set of standards that I can refer to as part of a line item on the budget. Sorry, it just didn't come out that way. We had multiple committees going on at different times. We were bringing in groups of teachers at all different grade levels. We were bringing in experts from the college level, and Wilfried Schmidt, who was a professor of mathematics at Harvard, who I know is known to Professor Milgram, donated most of his time pro bono. This is what I found, by the way, was true of academic experts already on salary elsewhere. They would donate their time pro bono to the development of better standards in the state.
In the interest of time, the committee will keep looking
Yeah,
at that. Thank you.
it's assessment items, can't tell you. either.
Representative Olson, and then Meyer, and then Roy.
I have one question, not sure who should answer, potentially Mr. Sauer, but I'm curious, are there any states that have accepted Race to the Top funds and who have adopted the common set of standards required by that are not part of either consortia?
No, no. That I know for sure, but we can go here.
Thank you. Dr. Stotsky, what benchmarking occurred on the validation committee for the Common Core standards?
There was no benchmarking that we are aware of. That is the problem. That's why we didn't sign off. Benchmarking means making a comparison with other standards from high-achieving countries, which is what I kept asking for from the time I started in 2009 on this committee. We never got it. In other words, they have a page of references, so-called, that they claim they have. But if you look at them, not one of them is a study showing a crosswalk or a comparison between Common Core's final standards as they came out, which you have to wait until June 2010 for, and then seeing what's comparison with Singapore, South Korea, Japan, or whatever other countries they want to see as high achieving.
Representative Roy.
It just isn't there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Stotsky,
We heard from you and from Dr. Milgram about the weaknesses, the existing weaknesses in the math and language standards that were developed by Common Core. So my concern now goes back to those students, for instance, in the states now that have gone on to develop better standards. What did they do with those students then that had fallen behind from the Common Core standards to get them back on track?
This is still a work in progress, we don't know. Every state is in a different phase of implementation. Remember, the standards were adopted in 2010. They didn't start getting into the schools until 2011, and in the last couple of years, it's been an irregular implementation from state to state, and we don't have any comprehensive, systematic information on what is happening across states. It's just not available. All you have are anecdotal kinds of reports from communities, teachers, states.
Representative Johnson.
My question would be for Representative Casper.
Okay. Representative Mock's got a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Dr. Stotsky. If you would mind coming back to the podium. And I have a couple questions that will be very brief. Actually, Dr. Stotsky, in response to one of the last questions you had mentioned, you cited Minnesota as an example that has great standards.
In mathematics, it did not adopt Common Core. In English, it did.
And that was I guess that was my question, is because you mentioned that we could adopt the Minnesota standards in their testing, and you cited that Minnesota was in a good position, but they did adopt the Common Core standards for English language arts.
Yes, in English. I can't tell you about their testing, and perhaps Professor Milgram knows more than I. That's separate, and I don't know what they do to test their own math standards, but it's obviously not a Common Core-based test.
Okay. And if I may, I took a lot of notes during your testimony, so forgive me if I'm trying to revisit back at, you were concerned on the Common Core standards for a few reasons. One, that a private organization drafted the standards and since they were copyright protected. Is this correct?
Yes.
And that it was not written by people who would otherwise be eligible or should be qualified to write educational standards. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so my question to you, Dr. Stotsky, is there's nothing in this bill that would prohibit a private organization from drafting the North Dakota standards. Wouldn't it potentially be subject to similar copyright protections?
Then you would have to be sure as a legislature that you had appointed the interim director as someone whose judgment you could rely on. And that would be under your control.
And is it, the bill states that the task force include legislators, administrators, higher ed faculty members, teachers, parents, business representatives, state officials, and government staff. Does that sound like a task force that seems equipped and qualified to draft educational standards?
If you went back to look at my exact procedures, which this is a summary of, and I'm sorry that it's such a condensed summary, I've outlined and have published elsewhere what I see as a series of steps. And the critical thing is to get chairmen of these committees who come from your own higher ed institutions. If you can't trust them, I don't know who else you can trust. I mean, ultimately, it's a question of where you can trust, who's going to be a good person to be in charge of your math standards redevelopment, your dean of engineering. I mean, if you can't trust your own dean of your own college of engineering, I wouldn't know where else to tell you to go. I mean, at some point, you have to trust your own experts. They teach your children.
Mr. Chair, I've got an invitation for the three, for those that have testified, just because the question was asked about who is compensating individuals to testify. Representative Casper mentioned that the three of you, professionals who've traveled to North Dakota, have not been compensated in any way. I'd like to invite you to make this on the record. Just so that there's no conflict of interest, do you or any of the individuals who testified intend to bid or compete to be a part of the drafting process for educational standards, or are you a part of an organization that would intend to compete for those?
Absolutely not. I function as an independent at all times.
And throughout
I
the course,
volunteered my time pro bono, as a matter of fact.
So I just wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to state that in case there was, and if any of the others that testified would want to make that as part of the record, we certainly invite that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And then Schreiber back.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.